Alright, so here I am at Honda Wing World in Mumbai
That's what I told.
with Zarnush, and I'd gone in to actually service my 2018 Africa Twin DCT. But I decided it was a good day because it was sunny to also take a second test ride.
I wanted
I've had one initial test ride during a rainy day on the Africa Twin Adventure Sports. There it is.
all right.
And I'm going to take it out for another ride today, for a second ride, because we've been blessed by the weather gods with a sunny day during the monsoon.
Yeah, let's do it.
So Honda have brought in the Adventure Sports version of this bike and haven't got the standard version in India this time. But they've done one thing that all the fans of Honda are thanking them for. They've got both the manual version as well as the DCT version. My Africa Twin in 2018 was only available in the DCT version, and so I loved the bike and I got it. But I was a little apprehensive about what DCT would feel like. But DCT was fantastic. It's great in traffic. It's amazing off-road. Makes you feel like an absolute hero when you're riding off-road or on trails and stuff like that. Even newbies can feel very confident. So I really enjoyed it, but it's been about 2 years now and I want to upgrade the bike as well as try something different. So I'm looking at the manual version of the bike, which is available. Of course, it's a different version. This is the Africa Twin Adventure Sports, which is here. I'm taking some B-roll, which will show up on the edit just about right now. And here it goes. Boom, there we are. Okay, so take a good look at this bike. It's very beautiful looking. The colors are fantastic. It's got that tricolor, the white, blue and red, almost like France's flag or something. But it's a beautiful looking bike. It's got those magnificent forks up front, which look so amazing in the gold color that they've got. The scheme is really fantastic. If you look at the rims and the suspension, it's got a different color. Really offsets the white, blue and red, which is almost like a Transformers kind of bike, but it's really nice looking. It looks like a giant dirt bike, and that's the kind of look I really like in an adventure bike. It feels like it means business, and that's clearly important for all of us. Our bikes need to look good, but of course they need to perform beautifully as well, and this bike does that. Let's see if the Adventure Sports lives up to the entire hype that's being created around this bike. So what Honda has done for this year with the Africa Twin is that they've increased the engine capacity to 1100, and this bike, when I first rode it, felt almost in the GS class because it feels very powerful straight off the first gear. When you launch the bike, it feels really powerful, has a lot of torque, and that was the characteristic of the Africa Twin in general, but it's just been accentuated and exaggerated with this bike because the power is up. It's over 100 horses now compared to, I think it was 87 for the Africa Twin in 2018, the version that I have. And of course the power going up really helps the case of any bike. It's shed a lot of weight as well. So if you think about it, it's got a 24-liter tank, which is 6 liters more
Go past the airport to the next.
than my Africa Twin.
Because the airport is very close.
But also beyond that,
Airport, the next U-turn.
it's shed about 5 kgs. So if you total it up and compare like for like, it should be about 11 kgs lighter than the bike that I currently ride. And that should make it fairly nimble. It should make it fairly interesting, but it depends on the chassis. So let's take a ride and find out what this bike is all about. Also, the electronics that they've added is, so this bike now has cornering ABS, cornering traction control. They've got a 6-axis IMU so that it measures movement in all directions, and that also, by the way, informs the DCT version of this bike to take better decisions. But I'm not concerned about that because I'm only interested in the manual version. But it's nice to know that the electronics will have your back if you're trying something interesting on the streets or even off-road. So once again, to reiterate, this is really the touring focused version of the bike. It's meant to cover long distances, go over really terrible roads, trails, all of that. But
Rev limiter here.
for all that everyone says about this being touring focused, I mean, from the specifications, it looks like it should be able to handle everything that you can throw its way off-road as well, because it's got more or less the same specifications, if not better in all respects from the previous bike. And
How do I move this one?
it's lighter. So I can only imagine this being better off-road if anything, but obviously it would depend how the suspension set up, what this bike is set up to do really well. There is one interesting fact before I set off, that in India, the version of this bike that comes will not have 250 mm of ground clearance. It has 210 mm of ground clearance. So that should, I think that might be because the seat height otherwise might have been perceived to be too high for Indian riders or riders in certain countries. Anyway, we are off now, and this seat right now is on the lower setting, which I didn't realize until a little bit ahead in the journey. So it was feeling very nimble, quite low, very easy to reach. Center of gravity was also quite low. And so it's a very, very comfortable bike to ride, especially if you've ridden the previous Africa Twin. This feels like a breeze. It's very light, very, very easy, very nimble. Feels like you can flick it in and out of traffic. It's not as nimble as the Tiger 900 felt, which I test rode recently, but it's very, very nimble, much more nimble than the previous bike. Feels it can change direction. You can crawl through gaps in traffic if you can handle the width of the bike itself and the broad tank. So because of the extra volume that they've had to build in the tank is very broad, and it kind of, that's one thing that I don't really like about this bike. But there's such few things that you have to nitpick with this bike. And the tank actually is a little bit broad up front, but they've shaped it nicely so that where you put your knees, it's actually relatively slim. It just opens up out in front, but does take away a little bit of the flexibility of moving around in the tank if you're going off-road or you're standing up on the bike. So we're setting off and going towards the highway to see what this bike is capable of. I'm going over some speed breakers standing up here, and the first thing I noticed at this stage was that the suspension setup is quite stiff. And that was a little bit surprising, because typically on adventure bikes you want a plush suspension when you're riding over speed breakers and things like that. But this was set up to be quite stiff. It felt like a sports bike, but the handling, therefore, was actually quite good. It felt quite nice. It felt very much in control. I felt like I could be, much more together in the traffic. I could, I didn't have to anticipate traffic as much. I could have late reactions. Some of that, I think, could be put down to the fact that I was using a clutch, and I think there's a greater degree of control if you have control of both the clutch and the throttle. And in my DCT, you didn't do that, but the DCT was very easy to ride in traffic if you were riding it lazily, because you didn't have to think about the gear at all. And that's an absolute blessing for certain rides, for certain times when you're coming back into the city after a long ride and you hit traffic. I mean, you really appreciate the DCT then. But here, because I'm test riding it and kind of really keenly interested in the motoring right now, it feels really good to have that kind of control. And the bike's feeling really light, much lighter than the previous bike, much lighter than the 5 kgs that they've taken off the bike would suggest. By the way, the 5 kgs that I'm talking about is with regards to the adventure sports version. If you compare the standard version of the bike, and the manual version, that's now 226 kgs, which would be almost 17 kgs lighter than the 2018 DCT Africa Twin. And that would have made a huge difference. I would have loved to try the bike, although that bike has tubed tires again, and which is a huge pet peeve for lots of riders in India, where punctures are fairly common and it becomes a huge problem. This bike has tubeless tires, and so if you get a puncture while traveling somewhere, you're not going to have such a big issue, because you can repair it very quickly and easily. But this bike really feels amazing once you let it go. Even if you get a small gap in the traffic, it's like a sports bike. It has tremendous power, don't forget it. And it can surprise you, because it doesn't look like the kind of bike that can be so quick. But if you twist the throttle, and if you're enthusiastic with your use of the throttle and the clutch on this bike, it can really surprise you. I think it can easily do wheelies, and I think it has wheelie control as part of the electronics suite. And I think there's a reason for that, because this bike can wheelie. I'm sure of it. I didn't try it. This is a test ride bike, and I wouldn't try it on public roads anyway. But this definitely feels like it's a rocket straight out of the gate. When you start it, the power and the torque, you can really feel it. It feels quite different. Again, much more power there than you would anticipate from something that's gone up only by 100cc. And by a few, by 15 bhp or 13 bhp or whatever it is. Actually 87, 13, 14 bhp. So, but it would suggest a small increase in power, but actually this bike feels much more powerful. And like I said, it feels almost like it's in the GS class now. And I know that it's essentially, here I'm telling my co-rider from Honda that I've just realized that I'm on the low seat setting and I'd like to raise it to the high seat setting. which we're going to do across the signal. But I was talking about how this bike feels very much in the GS class. I've ridden the 1200 GS, not the 1250, which I believe is a little more powerful, but the 1200 GS felt a little bit like the Africa Twin feels now, the adventure sports version feels now. And that's quite interesting because it seems to have a lot of power, a lot of torque, and it feels like a really big, solidly built bike that you could take from, for 5,000 kilometers on a single ride and you'd be fine. And if you look at the tank here, you'll get a quick glimpse. Also, I'm able to flat foot on the low seat setting. I'm 5'11", I could flat foot my feet. I wasn't even wearing boots, I was wearing sports riding boots, which don't have much of a sole, and I could flat foot on either side. But actually, once you get used to riding heavy bikes like these adventure bikes, at least personally, I enjoy riding on the higher seat setting because it gives me a much better riding position. I feel more engaged with the bike. You can ride it a little more aggressively. That's what I feel. I'm no expert, to be honest, but the sense of balance that you get, the sense of excitement, the sense of being in control, the sense of being high, having a vantage point, and you can ride it like I guess dirt bikes have a similar structure. They have seats that are quite high and they're quite tall, and I think that's for a reason. So if you kind of ride it like an adventure bike rather than like a sports bike where you're leaning into the corners and stuff like that, which I guess these bikes are not meant to be ridden like that. And if you ride them like dirt bikes are ridden, then it's really nice to have some of that height, extra height actually, to get a little bit of that position right. So here we are trying to figure out, and this is a very complicated system compared to the older bike, which is very simple in terms of changing the seat position. This one, you have to take off the rear seat and then adjust something, and it's not very intuitive. That's why we're taking so much time over it. But anyway, don't worry, I'm not going to subject you to this very much longer. I'm going to cut the footage out and just move on to the next ride. But just to point out a few little quirks on this bike. One is the wide tank, like I told you, which you can see here, and the second thing is this whole seat business. But of course, it's not going to bother you because once you set it typically at your height, it's going to be fine. And the rear seat coming off actually is pretty easy and provides you some excellent storage very quickly, and I think there's definitely more space there. This bike, clearly, the philosophy of this bike was really to set this up as a touring bike as opposed to an off-road focused bike, which I think the philosophy of the standard version of the Africa Twin is. A rally bike, an off-road bike. But this bike was meant for people who are essentially going long-distance touring and may come across very varied conditions. So it's extremely versatile. You can do a whole bunch of stuff. You can do lots of off-roading. Now, I won't even say mild off-roading. You can do a fair amount of off-roading if you've got the skills. It can do all of that. But it's actually got a huge amount of capability in terms of long-distance, comfortable touring, a lot of power now. Even at the top end, you don't feel like it's running out of breath. The earlier bike used to feel after 5,000, maybe 6,000 RPM, it used to feel not stressed because it could handle it. It's a great engine, but it just used to not feel at home at those RPMs. Not so with this bike. As soon as you set off, you really enjoy that power. That's on tap. The torque is just beautiful. This engine is an absolute gem from Honda. And don't even talk about the exhaust note. We motorcyclists make a big thing about exhaust note, and I think it's really deeply connected to your riding experience, and that's why it's so important to all of us. And some of us spend a lot of money in changing out the stock exhaust and making it sound different and better and whatever resonates with your frequency. But this stock exhaust has to be, if not the best, definitely one of the best exhaust notes I've ever heard on any bike. And it's absolutely fantastic, combined with that big 1100cc engine. It's got some serious quality, some serious timbre coming from that sound, and it's got a firing order that makes things very interesting, and it's got like an amazing character. You'll absolutely love this kind of sound on this bike. I've never heard a parallel twin sound like this ever. And so it's really a fantastic sound, and that's something that one has to compliment Honda for, because it's absolutely beautiful. It's aesthetically very pleasing. It helps you connect with the bike very deeply, especially when you feel the engine. Another thing I'm loving about this bike is how nimble it feels, because it's shed all that weight, the engine character, the clutch on this manual bike. a whole bunch of things are coming together to make this bike feel much more nimble. And look at this rough patch that I've suddenly run into that I didn't realize was there, and I came across this, and this bike can handle all of this stuff like an absolute boss. But like I mentioned earlier, the suspension's set up in this stock condition on this test bike, and I guess that's how Honda wants us to experience this bike, fairly stiffly. It feels like it's more sports-like. It feels like it's in sports mode rather than plush and absorbing everything and with a lot of movement. Of course, it has 230 mm of movement in the front suspension and 220 mm at the back, so there's more than enough to absorb anything that comes your way, but it's just set up stiffly. And I'm sure it's an adjustable suspension anyway, so you can change that and make it more plush, I'm sure. But the stock setting like this, obviously it's a message from Honda, and like I said again, this is not marketed or set up to be an off-road focused bike. This is the touring version, and you'd want something that stays on the tarmac for much longer to behave very well there. This kind of suspension would really help it do that. But you have to get used to it if you're coming from the old Africa Twin to this kind of suspension, slightly different. And of course you have to, kind of after a couple of thousand kilometers or whenever it is that you feel, you have to set up the suspension to suit your own riding style. And you can always do that with the adjustable suspension. So it feels good in certain respects because you have a lot of control of the chassis because of this suspension. But I do miss the plush nature of my adventure bike, where I've set up the suspension to be even more plush than normal, and it really handles Indian roads very nicely from for my weight, my solo riding style, all of that. But of course, once this bike is in my hands, or if it is in my hands, I would do the same to this bike in terms of setting up the suspension. So those are really my conclusions in a nutshell after this test ride, is that this bike is much more nimble, feels much lighter, feels much more powerful, much more than the figures would suggest in terms of how much weight it is shed, how many more bhp have been added to the bike. So they've done something really magical with this bike, and they've kind of tuned it beautifully. It feels fantastic on the road. Just a couple of things you have to take note of. This bike in India, the specifications are that the ground clearance is 210 mm, not 250 mm, which is true for international markets. I think India and certain other markets, they have a lower seat height, and therefore they have lower ground clearance, and that's gone down by 40 mm. It may not be very important for most riders who are not considering doing serious off-roading with this bike. Mild off-roading, intermediate off-roading, this bike, I think, in my not expert opinion, will be absolutely fine. But it's just common sense if you look at what this bike is capable of in terms of its kit, its suspension travel, how it's set up, that it should be able to do a fair amount of off-road without really bothering you at all. But if you're a hardcore off-roader, you might find that a concern, that you want 250 instead of 210. It's 40 mm, not a really small figure for somebody who's concerned with that sort of thing. So this is clearly focused towards touring, spending a lot more time on the tarmac and on really bad roads and trails. And it's a fantastic bike for that. And let's face it, most of us really spend our 99% of our time in those kind of conditions. We want versatility. We want to be able to travel long distances comfortably. And occasionally when we come across challenging conditions, we want a bike that can handle it. This definitely can. The only thing you have to deal with is a slightly stiffer suspension in the stock setup, which offers a better riding experience on the road, but might be something that's not a preference, like it is for me personally, to have slightly softer suspension so that it can be a plush ride for me most of the time. But that's again something that I'll have to figure out if it can go to those kind of suspension settings, because it's adjustable, and there's no reason to think that with that kind of travel available in the suspension that you shouldn't be able to set it up to be absolutely comfortable to your needs. So that's really it. I mean, I think apart from the wider tank and the slightly stiff suspension, everything on this bike really surprised me very pleasantly. Really enjoyed it. There's a small irritant. You can see it on your screen right now. There's this very tall screen, and you're forced to look through it if you're at a certain height. It didn't bother me too much through the ride. I got used to it, but I'm also used to my Africa Twin having a fairly large windshield as it is. And in the 2020 version of the standard version of the Africa Twin, they've actually lowered the screen. It's a short screen, much like it would be for off-road bikes. So they're clearly taking the separation in these bikes seriously in terms of positioning standard version as the rally version, and this one is the long distance comfort touring GS competitor. There's not much else to say really, because Honda also comes with this huge reliability factor. Its engines are legendary, bulletproof, will last a really long time. You can do 100,000 kilometers in them before you have to worry about anything, apparently. Now, once again, I can't personally vouch for it, but I've had a really great experience with Honda, and everyone that rides Honda says they've got a great ethic in terms of how they build their bikes. The engineering is fantastic. We all know that. The Japanese bikes are all great, and Honda, I think, in terms of just maintenance and engineering, are really top of the heap. So that comes with the brand. Of course, the bikes have to prove themselves, and there are other bikes that are competition that are also equally compelling in terms of the reasons that you could invest in them or look at riding them. They're very exciting. The Tiger, for example, 900, the direct competition to this bike, although some would argue that this is in a different class because it's a 200cc difference, but if you look at the power figures and stuff like that, it's fairly similar. If you look at the features, they're fairly similar. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the 900 actually seems, a couple of features seem inspired by the Africa Twin, such as the split radiator and things to reduce the heat, and because the Africa Twin was always very good at heat management. And even on this bike, by the way, I didn't feel the heat at all, and it wasn't a particularly hot day today. It was a relatively light cloudy day and with some sunshine, but I didn't feel the heat at all. It didn't bother me one bit, although I was just riding jeans. So, but the competition, talking about the Tiger 900, I think the Tiger 900 is a much more nimble bike. It feels almost like a sports bike, and it feels much lighter. I think it is much lighter. They don't give out wet weight figures, but I think people have calculated it, and it would be around 220 kilos for that bike. And this bike, even if you compare like for like, if in terms of removing the disadvantage of a larger fuel tank and taking away 6 liters of fuel, it's still at 232. So that's a 12 kg difference, which is significant, and you can feel it on the Tiger. It's a very nimble bike. This bike feels a little more smooth, despite being a parallel twin. It feels relatively smooth, even if you at higher RPMs. So at 4,000 or 5,000 RPM, I literally couldn't feel any vibrations. Whereas with the Tiger, it's a fantastic engine. The new engine has a lot of grunt at the bottom, a lot of character, very interesting engine. And I love the fact that it hasn't lost its old whistle, but there's a grunt added, there's a growl added. But this bike, look at it, by the way, it looks fantastic in these resplendent colors. And I absolutely love the look of this bike. So it feels fairly premium as well. And look at that exhaust sound. Just hear that. It's absolutely beautiful. I was talking about the Tiger 900, the competition to this. There's definitely compelling reasons. If you want something that's nimble, light, easily manageable, very quick to dart in and out of traffic, and almost like a dual sports / adventure bike, which is light, then the Tiger could be very compelling. It's actually a very interesting bike. Just few vibes at 4,000 or 5,000 RPM is what it has, but most riders say it doesn't bother them. It kind of depends on your personal preference. But with Honda comes certain brand values that are attached, so it's kind of really a personal decision. I think these bikes are fairly evenly matched, and the prices are also fairly similar, although the Tiger has a version which is about 1.5 lakhs cheaper, just about 1.5 lakhs, so maybe slightly under. And so that offers an option that is a slightly more economical option than this bike. But having said that, I mean, it's not really, when you're talking about such expensive bikes, a lakh here or 50,000-70,000 here or there, it's not going to make a massive difference. I mean, obviously it's a concern, but it's not a massive difference because you're investing in something that's quite expensive, and you might as well look at something that's going to stick with you for a long time, that you'll enjoy. And so they're fairly evenly matched in terms of kit, in terms of the electronics, in terms of the capabilities. And the only thing I'd say is that Triumph usually brings its entire range, and they haven't got the GT Pro, but they've got the GT, they've got the Rally, they've got the Rally Pro, so there's a fair amount to choose from. Whereas with Honda, and I believe that's about to change, but with Honda currently, they tend to bring very limited pieces into the country, so that for example, these bikes are already apparently sold out, and you have a waiting list now to be able to get the Africa Twin Adventure Sports. which might be a long wait before they turn up in this country again. So that's another factor that might influence your buying decision. And the other thing is that the Tiger actually is meant to go off-road, because they've clearly addressed a lot of the issues that the Tiger 800 had in terms of going off-road. It was a fantastic on-the-road bike, and they've addressed all of those issues, and now apparently it's become a fantastic off-road bike. I haven't ridden it off-road, but it felt light, it felt like it had a lot of grunt at the bottom end, it felt very different in character, and apparently the engine really suits off-road riding. So it's become something that's much better at off-roading. And now actually the positions are reversed, because the last time when I got my Africa Twin 2018, the Africa Twin was supposed to be the boss off-road, and the Tiger was supposed to be jack of all trades. It could do everything. It was much better on the road, on the tarmac. It had an engine full of character, very, very smooth, and it wasn't fantastic off-road. I mean, it could handle off-road, and a lot of people used it to go all kinds of places, and especially it depends on your skill, but generally speaking, all things being equal, the Africa Twin was definitely a much better off-road bike. And now I think the positions are reversed, because Honda has got the Adventure Sports version, which is the touring version, and the Tiger has addressed all of its issues with its off-road creds. So that's an interesting pivot that both the companies have done, in India at least. And if you're a rich man, there's obviously the 1250 GS to consider. You could also look at the 850 GS, by the way, which is more reasonable, still expensive. And if I were a rich man, then I would have multiple bikes anyway. But this is a pretty good bike in terms of the value that it's offering at this price. The Africa Twin Adventure Sports. It's got competition, and as Indian consumers, we love that. Just makes things exciting for everybody. But this bike, if there's one asset or one or two assets that I would point out, it would be the engine. Fantastic engine after they've developed it upward from 1000 to 1100 cc, and that exhaust note. Together, it's absolutely beautiful. Maybe dynamically it's not as fantastic as I'd have wanted, but it's quite phenomenal as an overall package, and the engine absolutely is a beauty. And of course there's that whole Africa Twin legacy, which is beautiful. I've absolutely loved owning the 2018 Africa Twin with the DCT, and this would be a great successor in that sense, because it's definitely a huge upgrade. Lots of electronics, lots more power, lots more grunt, different riding character. It feels similar but different, and it offers that novelty. If you get this as a bike, it won't feel like you're riding something very similar to your old bike if you're upgrading from the Africa Twin even. So lots of things going for this bike. I really love it. This ride was great. I'm glad the weather held up. Really fantastic. Couple of smaller notes: the brakes work really well. You can work them in traffic, and they're absolutely confidence inspiring. So there's your safety taken care of. Apart from the electronics, the brakes work really well. They've got good feel. The front of the wheel, the front of the bike, the front wheel used to feel a little less planted in the older Africa Twin, and this corrects it. I don't know how the setup has been made, built, etc., and maybe the lower ground clearance has something to do with it. I'm not really sure, but it definitely feels a lot more planted in front, so you can move it around a little bit more. Feels like there's more control in this bike. It's got great livery, it looks good, it's solid, and it'll stay with you for the next 10 years if you want. Keep it serviced, keep it maintained, and you can take it to any part of the country. It's definitely a very, if you take a look at this beautiful bike, it's definitely a very, very comfortable, fantastic touring bike to go long distances, cover great heaps of this country, great parts of this country, go everywhere that you want. Once this COVID situation eases up, ride anywhere you want. It'll be a fantastic companion. So you could do far worse than this Africa Twin. I actually really like this bike quite a lot. So thanks for watching this review. It was a different style, very laid back, very long, but sometimes riders enjoy this kind of stuff, and I hope you've enjoyed this review a little bit. Please put your comments below, and if you have any questions, please ask me. I'd be happy to answer them. And we're going to look at the BMW F900 XR very soon, because that's another option in terms of going touring. But until then, adios.
Superb.